The rope still swayed in the morning wind when Marcus Thompson found her crumpled beneath the gallows like a discarded prayer. By evening, 3 badges would lose their shine, and the town of Millbrook would discover that some sins cast shadows longer than any noose. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The frost hadn't yet melted from the wooden planks when Marcus Thompson rode into the town square at dawn. Millbrook lay silent as a graveyard. Windows shuttered tight against the October chill that had settled over the Colorado territory like a shroud. The gallows stood in the center of the square, a grim monument to frontier justice, its shadow stretching long across the packed earth. Marcus had ridden hard through the night, his sorrel mare's breath forming white clouds in the bitter air. 3 weeks had passed since he'd buried his wife Sarah beneath the cottonwoods on his ranch. 3 weeks since consumption had stolen the only light his world had known. The grief sat heavy in his chest, a weight that made breathing feel like drowning. He'd come to town for supplies, nothing more: flour, coffee, ammunition. The basic necessities of a man who no longer saw the point in living, but hadn't yet found the courage to die. The mare's hooves echoed hollow against the frozen ground as they approached the general store. That's when Marcus saw her, a dark shape huddled beneath the gallows platform, motionless as death itself. At first, he thought it might be a bundle of old clothes or a vagrant's abandoned belongings. But something about the way the wind stirred the fabric made him look closer. She was a woman, young from what he could tell, curled on her side with her knees drawn to her chest. Her dress, once perhaps blue or gray, was torn and stained with mud and something darker, blood. Her hair, matted and tangled, covered most of her face, but he could see the purple bruising along her jaw, the split lip, the way her left arm hung. At an unnatural angle, Marcus dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. The town remained eerily quiet, no smoke from chimneys, no early risers heading to work, no sound save the creak of the gallows rope and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. It was as if Millbrook itself was holding its breath. He knelt beside the woman, careful not to startle her if she was conscious. Her breathing was shallow but steady, each exhale visible in the cold air. Her clothes were thin, inadequate for the mountain chill, and her hands were blue-white with cold. Whoever had left her here hadn't expected her to survive the night. "Ma'am?" Marcus spoke softly, his voice roughened by weeks of disuse. "Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. He could see now that she was perhaps 25, with delicate features made harsh by violence and exposure. A thin gold chain around her neck held a small wooden cross, worn smooth by years of handling. As he watched, her lips moved almost imperceptibly, forming words too quiet to hear. Marcus leaned closer, and finally caught the whispered prayer. "Lord, if this is where I die, let it mean something. Let someone remember that I tried to do right." The words hit him like a physical blow. Here was a woman beaten nearly to death, abandoned to die beneath the symbol of the town's justice. And still she prayed not for revenge but for meaning. Sarah had prayed similar words in her final days, asking not for healing but for their love to matter, for her life to have left some mark on the world. Without another thought, Marcus gathered the woman into his arms. She was lighter than he'd expected, her frame small and fragile beneath the torn dress. She stirred slightly as he lifted her, a soft moan escaping her lips, but her eyes remained closed. He carried her to his horse, settling her carefully across the saddle before mounting behind her to keep her steady. The ride back to his ranch took 2 hours through winding mountain trails. The woman drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes murmuring what sounded like names. "Emma," "Papa," "Please," but mostly she remained silent, her body limp against his chest. Marcus found himself talking to her as they rode, sharing stories about Sarah, about the ranch, about anything that might anchor her to the world of the living. "My wife used to say that God puts people in our path when we need them most," he said as they crested a hill overlooking his valley. "Course, she also said that sometimes we're the ones being put in someone else's path. Never could figure out which was which." The Thompson Ranch sprawled across a valley carved between two ridges of pine-covered mountains. The house itself was modest, a two-story structure of logs and stone with a wide front porch and windows that caught the morning sun. Behind it stood a barn, a chicken coop, and several smaller outbuildings, all showing signs of recent neglect. Since Sarah's death, Marcus had done only the bare minimum to keep the place running. He carried the woman into the house, laying her gently on the sofa in the front room. The fire had long since died to cold ashes, and the house held the chill of abandonment. Marcus quickly built up the fire, filling the room with warmth and flickering light, then fetched blankets from the bedroom blankets that still held the faint scent of lavender soap that Sarah had loved in the kitchen. He found Sarah's medical supplies. She'd served as the closest thing to a doctor the scattered ranchers had, delivering babies and tending wounds with gentle hands and infinite patience. Marcus had watched her work countless times, absorbing knowledge he'd never expected to need. Woman's injuries were extensive, but not, he thought, fatal if properly treated. Her left arm was indeed broken, the bones snapped clean but not protruding through the skin. Her ribs showed signs of savage kicking, purple bruises blooming across her torso like deadly flowers. The cut on her head had bled freely but wasn't deep. Worst of all were the rope burns around her wrists and ankles, evidence of prolonged restraint. As Marcus cleaned her wounds with warm water and carbolic acid, he found himself studying her face. Even battered and bruised, she possessed a quiet strength that reminded him of Sarah. There was something in the set of her jaw, the way her hands curled even in unconsciousness, that spoke of someone who'd faced hardship before and survived it. Hours passed as he worked, setting the broken arm with splints cut from an old crate, wrapping her ribs with strips torn from clean sheets, cleaning and dressing each wound with the careful attention Sarah had taught him. The woman stirred occasionally, sometimes crying out in what sounded like terror, other times whispering prayers or names he couldn't quite catch. It was near noon when she finally opened her eyes fully. They were brown, the color of rich earth, and filled with a wariness that spoke of recent betrayal. She stared at him for a long moment, taking in his weathered face, his gentle hands, the clean bandages on her arms. "Where am I?" Her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from screaming. "Or cold, or both." "My ranch, about 10 miles south of Millbrook. You're safe here." She tried to sit up, winced at the pain, and fell back against the cushions. "You found me under the ... the gallows, yes. This morning, just after dawn." Tears gathered in her eyes. Not from physical pain, but from something deeper. "They left me there to die." Marcus pulled a chair close to the sofa and sat down, his hands folded in his lap. "Who did?" She closed her eyes, and for a moment he thought she might have drifted back into unconsciousness. But then she spoke, her voice steady despite the tears that tracked down her cheeks. "My name is Rebecca Walsh. I was ... I am a teacher. Or I was, until 3 days ago." The story that emerged over the next hour was like something from a nightmare. Rebecca had come to Millbrook 6 months earlier, hired to teach the children of the growing town. She'd been young, idealistic, believing that education could lift even the roughest frontier settlement toward something better. What she'd found instead was a town run by 3 men who wore badges, but served only their own appetites for power and profit. Sheriff Caleb Morrison was the public face of their corruption, a man who collected taxes that never reached the territorial government and settled disputes with his fists rather than the law. His 2 deputies, brothers named Frank and Jesse Crawford, enforced his will with casual brutality that kept the townspeople too terrified to resist. Rebecca had made the mistake of keeping records. As the town's teacher, she'd noticed when children stopped coming to school, when families suddenly packed up and left in the middle of the night, when women developed bruises they claimed came from falling downstairs. She documented it all in a journal, thinking perhaps to send it to the territorial authorities, to someone who might bring real justice to Millbrook. The Crawford brothers had found the journal when they'd broken into the schoolhouse 3 nights ago. They'd dragged Rebecca from her bed, beaten her unconscious, and when she'd awakened, she'd found herself in the jail cell, facing Sheriff Morrison's cold smile. "Said I was a troublemaker," Rebecca continued, her voice growing stronger as she talked. "Said the town didn't need my kind of thinking. They kept me in that cell for 2 days, taking turns, hurting me, making sure I understood what happened to people who didn't mind their own business." Marcus felt rage building in his chest, a hot, clean anger he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. These weren't lawmen, they were predators wearing badges, wolves who'd found a flock without a shepherd. The 3rd night, Morrison said they were going to make an example of me. Said they'd tell everyone I'd been caught stealing, that I'd tried to seduce respectable married men, that I was everything wrong with the kind of women who came west thinking they could act like men. Rebecca's laugh was bitter as the winter wind. They dragged me to the gallows, put the noose around my neck. Morrison said he was going to let me dangle there until I died, then claim I'd committed suicide out of shame. She paused, touching the rope burns at her throat with trembling fingers. But Frank Crawford, he was drunk, got excited, started pulling on the rope before Morrison was ready. The whole thing came down the beam, wasn't properly secured. I fell hard, hit my head, and when I came to, they were arguing about what to do next. The rest of the story came in fragments. The 3 men had decided to leave Rebecca beneath the gallows, figuring the cold would finish what the noose had failed to do. They kicked her until several ribs cracked, ensuring she couldn't crawl to safety, then left her to die while they worked out their story for the morning. They'll say I attacked them, that I tried to seduce Jesse Crawford, and when he refused, I went mad with shame. They'll say I stole money from the school fund, and when I was caught, I couldn't face the consequences. Rebecca met Marcus's eyes with a steadiness that amazed him. And people will believe them, because they wear badges and I'm just a woman alone. Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire that had burned low while Rebecca told her story. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows and sending snow devils dancing across the yard. Sarah's presence seemed to fill the room, not as a ghost, but as a memory of what justice could look like when good people refused to look away. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "My wife died 3 weeks ago," he said finally. "Consumption. I buried her up on the hill beneath the cottonwoods, and I've been walking around since then, like a man already dead. Didn't see much point in anything anymore." He turned to look at Rebecca, seeing in her battered face an echo of Sarah's quiet strength. "But finding you this morning, hearing your story, Sarah always said that when we stop fighting for what's right, we stop being human. Maybe she sent me to that town square. Maybe it was just a chance. Either way, you're not going to die under their gallows." Rebecca studied his face, searching for something she could trust. "What are you saying?" Marcus stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered peaks that surrounded his valley. "I'm saying that 3 men in Millbrook are about to discover that some women have friends they didn't count on, and some of those friends have nothing left to lose." The afternoon light was fading, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Somewhere beyond those peaks, 3 corrupt lawmen were probably congratulating themselves on a problem solved, a witness silenced. They had no way of knowing that their victim was alive, safe, and ready to tell her story to someone willing to listen. Marcus turned back to Rebecca, and for the first time in weeks, he felt something other than grief stirring in his chest. It was purpose, clean and sharp as a blade, and it felt like coming back to life. "Rest now," he said gently. Tomorrow we start setting things right." Rebecca closed her eyes, but not before Marcus saw something that hadn't been there before: hope. And as the fire crackled and the wind sang through the pines, two damaged souls began the slow work of healing. Not just their bodies, but their faith that justice was still possible in a world that often seemed to have forgotten its meaning. First part of their story was ending, but Marcus could feel the weight of what was coming. 3 badges would lose their shine, and the town of Millbrook would learn that some prayers are answered not with miracles, but with the simple courage of ordinary people who refuse to let evil win. Rebecca woke to the smell of bacon frying and coffee brewing, scents that seemed impossible after the nightmare of the past 3 days. Sunlight streamed through clean windows, warming her face in a way that made her remember what safety felt like. The pain in her ribs remained sharp, but the terror that had consumed her thoughts was replaced by something she'd almost forgotten: the possibility of a future. Marcus stood at the kitchen stove, his back to her as he tended the skillet. His movements were careful, methodical, the actions of a man accustomed to solitude, but not unkindness. She watched him for several minutes, noting the way he set 2 plates on the table, the way he poured coffee into both cups despite not knowing if she was awake. "You move quietly for someone with broken ribs," he said without turning around. Rebecca attempted a smile, though it pulled at her split lip. "My father taught me that a lady should glide through a room like a whisper. Never thought it would save my life one day." Marcus turned, carrying 2 steaming plates. The bacon was perfectly crisp, the eggs cooked exactly as Sarah used to make them. "Your father sounds like a wise man." He died when I was 16. Yellow fever took him and my mother both, within a week of each other. Rebecca accepted the plate gratefully, realizing she hadn't eaten in nearly 4 days. "Left me with nothing but an education and a stubborn streak he always said would get me in trouble." They ate in comfortable silence, the morning light painting everything golden. Through the windows, Rebecca could see the mountains that surrounded the valley, their peaks capped with snow that caught the sun like scattered diamonds. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache, not from her injuries, but from the sudden, fierce desire to live, to see this view again and again. "Tell me about them," Marcus said eventually, refilling their coffee cups. "Morrison and the Crawford brothers. How long have they been running Millbrook?" Rebecca set down her fork, her appetite fading as the memories returned. "Morrison came about 2 years ago, when the previous sheriff died in a hunting accident. At least, that's what people called it. Old Sheriff Bennett was found shot in the back while tracking elk. Morrison was a deputy then, claimed he'd been following Bennett's trail, and found the body." She paused, remembering the way the townspeople had whispered about it in the weeks that followed. The Crawford brothers showed up a month later, claiming to be Morrison's cousins from Kansas. Morrison made them deputies within a week. Sound Millbrook was growing too fast for one lawman to handle. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying her face. And the accident started happening. Not right away. Morrison was clever about it. For months, he was the perfect peace officer, fair, honest, helpful to the ladies, and respectful to the men. People started saying Millbrook was finally getting civilized, that we were lucky to have such dedicated law enforcement. Rebecca's voice grew bitter as she continued. Then the territorial tax collector came through, same as every year. Only this time, he was told the taxes had already been collected and sent to Denver. Morrison showed him official-looking papers, receipts, everything proper and legal. The tax man left satisfied, and Morrison kept every penny. The pattern had escalated from there. Businesses that competed with Morrison's interests suffered mysterious fires or break-ins. Families who asked too many questions about missing neighbors found themselves accused of theft or vagrancy and run out of town. Women who rebuffed the advances of the Crawford brothers discovered that their husbands faced sudden legal troubles that could only be resolved through Morrison's generosity. The Journal I kept. It documented 12 families that vanished in 18 months. Not moved away, not relocated for better opportunities. Vanished. Houses left with meals still on the tables, livestock abandoned in the fields, children's toys scattered in yards. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. You think they were killed? No, they were. I found the graves. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Rebecca stared into her coffee cup, remembering the day she'd followed a suspicious trail into the hills north of town. What she'd discovered there had turned her stomach and filled her with a cold determination that had ultimately led to her near death under the gallows. There's a meadow about 5 miles from Millbrook, hidden in a fold of the mountains where the water table runs shallow. Perfect for digging, but too remote for casual discovery. I counted at least 20 graves, maybe more. Some were old, weathered. Wooden markers with names I recognized from the missing persons list. Others were just mounds of earth. She looked up at Marcus, seeing her own horror reflected in his eyes. That's when I knew I had to document everything. Had to get word to someone with real authority. The territorial governor, the federal marshals, someone who could stop them. Marcus stood and walked to the window, his hands clenched into fists. Outside, a hawk circled high above the valley, riding the thermals with effortless grace. Sarah had loved watching the hawks, saying they reminded her that some things in the world remained free no matter how dark the times became. They'll come looking for you, he said finally. When they realize you survived, they'll tear this territory apart trying to find you. I know. Rebecca's voice was steady, but Marcus could hear the fear underneath. That's why I need to reach the territorial marshal in Colorado Springs before they discover I'm alive. If I can get my testimony to someone Morrison can't buy or intimidate... It's a 4-day ride to Colorado Springs. 5 if the weather turns bad. Marcus turned back to her, studying the bandages that covered her injuries. You're in no condition to travel. Rebecca started to protest, but Marcus held up a hand. I'm not saying we shouldn't go. I'm saying we need a plan that doesn't get you killed before you can tell your story. They spent the next hour discussing options. The main road to Colorado Springs would take them through 3 towns where Morrison had connections, where word of their passage would reach him within hours. The mountain trails were treacherous this time of year, especially for someone with broken ribs and a still healing head wound. There's another way, Marcus said eventually. Longer, but safer. My late wife had a sister in Cascade Falls, about 30 miles east. Martha runs a boarding house there, and her husband David is the local telegraph operator. If we can get you there, you could send word ahead to the marshal. Arrange to meet him somewhere Morrison can't interfere. Rebecca considered this, weighing the risks. You'd do that? Leave your ranch, travel dangerous roads with a stranger who's brought nothing but trouble? Marcus looked at her for a long moment, seeing not just the bruised and battered woman before him, but the courage that had driven her to document Morrison's crimes, the determination that had kept her alive under the gallows, the strength that radiated from her even now. Sarah used to say that we're all strangers until someone gives us a reason not to be. He stood and walked to a cabinet in the corner, retrieving a leather gun belt and holstered Colt revolver. Besides, I figure I owe Morrison and his friends a conversation about their treatment of ladies. As the day progressed, Marcus prepared for the journey with military precision. He'd served in the army during the final years of the Indian Wars, and the habits of survival had never left him. He cleaned and loaded 3 rifles, checked his ammunition supply, and packed enough food for a week on the trail. Rebecca watched him work, impressed by his competence and grateful for his quiet strength. When he offered her one of Sarah's dresses to replace her torn clothing, she accepted with tears in her eyes, not from pain, but from the kindness of a man who owed her nothing but was willing to risk everything. She was beautiful, Rebecca said, running her fingers over the soft blue fabric. A photograph on the mantelpiece showed Sarah Thompson as a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, standing beside a younger version of Marcus in front of the ranch house. Inside and out, Marcus agreed. Lost 3 babies before they could draw breath, but she never let the sorrow make her bitter. Just made her more determined to help other folks' children grow up safe and healthy. Rebecca understood then why. Marcus had found her beneath the gallows, why he'd brought her home without question. He was a man who'd learned that healing others could ease your own pain, that sometimes the best way to honor the dead was to protect the living. As afternoon faded toward evening, Marcus saddled 2 horses, his reliable sorrel mare and a gentler bay gelding that had been Sarah's favorite. He packed their supplies carefully, distributing weight to account for Rebecca's injuries and the rough terrain they'd face. "We'll leave before dawn," he told her as they shared a simple dinner. "Travel the back trails through Copper Canyon. Avoid the main roads until we're well clear of Morrison's territory. If we're lucky, we'll reach Martha's place by tomorrow evening." Rebecca nodded, though the thought of spending hours in the saddle with broken ribs made her stomach clench. What if they're already watching your ranch? What if they know I'm here? Marcus had considered this possibility. Then we deal with it. But Morrison thinks you're dead, and he's got no reason to connect your disappearance to me. Far as anyone knows, I'm just a grieving widower who keeps to himself. They spent the evening preparing for departure. Marcus showed Rebecca how to handle the small derringer he'd found among Sarah's things, a wedding gift her father had given her years ago. Rebecca proved to be a natural marksman, her teacher's steady hands adapting quickly to the unfamiliar weight of the weapon. "My father taught me to shoot when I was 12, she explained, sighting down the barrel at an imaginary target. Sighed. A woman alone needed to know how to protect herself, especially on the frontier. As full darkness settled over the valley, they reviewed their route one final time. Marcus spread a hand-drawn map across the kitchen table, tracing the mountain paths that would take them safely to Cascade Falls. The journey would be challenging, even for healthy travelers, but it offered their best chance of avoiding Morrison's network of informants and hired guns. "Once we reach Martha's place, you'll be safe," Marcus assured her. "David's telegraph connects to the territorial government in Colorado Springs. We can send word to Marshal Henderson, arrange a meeting on neutral ground." Rebecca studied the map, memorizing landmarks and alternate routes. "And if Morrison finds us before we get there?" Marcus's expression hardened. "Then he'll discover that some folks don't die as easy as he thinks." They retired early, knowing the next day would test them both in ways they couldn't fully anticipate. Rebecca lay on the sofa, staring at the dying embers in the fireplace and thinking about the graves in the hidden meadow, about the families who'd trusted Morrison to protect them only to find themselves buried in unmarked earth. Tomorrow would begin the most dangerous part of their journey, but for the first time since she'd started documenting Morrison's crimes, Rebecca felt something. Approaching hope. She wasn't alone anymore. She had an ally, a man whose quiet strength reminded her that good people still existed in a world that often seemed consumed by darkness. In the other room, Marcus sat by his bedroom window, rifle across his knees, watching the approaches to his ranch. The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant in the thin mountain air. Sarah's presence seemed to fill the silence, not as a ghost, but as a reminder of what was worth fighting for. 3 corrupt lawmen thought they'd silence the only witness to their crimes. Tomorrow they'd begin to learn how wrong they were. And somewhere in the distance, the wheels of justice, real justice, would finally begin to turn in Millbrook's direction. The second part of their story was ending, but Marcus could feel the weight of tomorrow's challenges settling over the ranch like fresh snow. The easy part was over. Now came the test that would determine whether Rebecca's prayer beneath the gallows would be answered, or whether Morrison's reign of terror would claim 2 more victims in the Colorado mountains. The pre-dawn darkness felt alive with danger as Marcus helped Rebecca into the saddle. Her face was pale with pain, but her jaw was set with determination that reminded him of soldiers he'd known, who fought through wounds that would have felled lesser men. The bay gelding stood patient as stone, as if sensing the importance of the burden he carried. "Remember," Marcus whispered as he checked the rifle scabbard one final time, "if shooting starts, you ride hard for those rocks we marked on the map. Don't look back, don't try to help. Just get to Cascade Falls and tell David to send word to Marshal Henderson." Rebecca nodded, though they both knew that if violence found them on the mountain trails, her chances of escape were slim. The broken ribs made it agony to breathe deeply, and hours in the saddle would push her body beyond its limits. But the alternative, staying at the ranch and waiting for Morrison to discover she'd survived, was certain death. They rode out under a canopy of stars, following a game trail that wound through stands of aspen and pine. The horses' breath created small clouds in the frigid air, and frost crunched beneath their hooves like breaking glass. Marcus had chosen this route carefully, avoiding the main roads and settlements where Morrison's influence reached poisonous routes through Colorado soil. For the first hour, they climbed steadily into the high country, following ridgelines that offered views of the valley below. No lights showed in Millbrook's windows, no smoke rose from chimneys. The town slept peacefully, unaware that its reign of terror was about to face its first real challenge. As the eastern sky began to lighten, painting the peaks in shades of rose and gold, Marcus called a halt beside a mountain stream. The water ran clear and cold, fed by snowmelt from the high peaks. While the horses drank, Rebecca dismounted carefully, each movement sending fresh waves of pain through her battered torso. "How are you holding up?" Marcus asked, offering her a canteen of coffee he'd prepared before their departure. "I'll make it," she said, though her voice carried the strain of forcing words through gritted teeth. "How much farther to the pass?" Marcus studied the terrain ahead, calculating distances and elevation gain. 3 hours, maybe 4. The trail gets steeper from here, but once we're over the divide, it's mostly downhill to Cascade Falls. They remounted and continued climbing, following switchbacks that had been carved by generations of hunters and prospectors. The trail was narrow, barely wide enough for a single horse, with drops that fell away into misty canyons where eagles soared on the morning. It was Rebecca who first spotted the riders. "Marcus," she said quietly, pointing toward a distant ridge. "Look there." 3 black specks moved across the skyline, following a parallel trail that would intersect with theirs near the pass. Even at this distance, Marcus could see they were pushing their horses hard, covering ground with the urgency of men who had a specific destination in mind. "Could be anyone," Rebecca said hopefully. "Prospectors maybe, or ranchers moving cattle." But Marcus was already studying the terrain with the tactical mind of a former cavalry officer. Wrong time of year for cattle drives. And prospectors don't travel in groups of 3 unless they're running from something. He pointed to a cluster of boulders ahead. "We need to get off this trail, now." They urged their horses forward, racing against time and distance. The rocks offered concealment, but would trap them if the pursuing riders had already spotted their movement. Marcus helped Rebecca dismount behind the largest boulder, then led both horses deeper into the rocky maze, where they'd be hidden from casual observation. "Stay low," he whispered, checking the loads in his rifle. "If those are Morrison's men, they're tracking us, not hunting randomly." They waited in tense silence as the sound of hoofbeats grew closer. Through gaps in the rocks, Marcus caught glimpses of the riders, 3 men in long coats, rifles held ready across their saddles. They moved with the confidence of hunters who knew their prey was ahead of them. The lead rider was tall and lean, with a week's worth of stubble and eyes that swept the terrain like a hawk searching for movement. Marcus didn't recognize him, but the man wore a deputy's badge that caught the morning light. Behind him rode 2 younger men, brothers by their similar features and matching expressions of cruel anticipation. Frank and Jesse Crawford, Rebecca breathed, recognizing them despite the distance. But who's the third man? Marcus studied the stranger, noting the way he held himself in the saddle, the practiced ease with which he handled his weapons. Bounty. Hunter, most likely. Morrison probably put a price on your head. The three riders paused at the exact spot where Marcus and Rebecca had left the main trail. The bounty hunter dismounted and examined the ground, reading sign with the skill of someone who'd tracked men through far worse terrain. He pointed toward the rocks, said something to the Crawford brothers that made them grin with anticipation. They know we're here, Marcus said grimly. Question is whether they want to take you alive or if Morrison's changed his plans. The bounty. Hunter remounted and the three men spread out, approaching the rocks from different angles to prevent escape. Marcus positioned himself where he could cover the most likely approach routes, while Rebecca crouched behind a granite outcrop with the derringer ready in her trembling hands. If it comes to shooting, Marcus told her, aim for the center of the chest and keep pulling the trigger until the gun's empty. Don't try to wound them. These aren't men who'll show mercy to a woman who fights back. The first shot came without warning, a rifle bullet that sparked off the rocks inches from Marcus's head. The Crawford brothers had spotted movement and opened fire, their shots echoing through the canyon like thunder. Marcus returned fire immediately, his bullet taking Frank Crawford in the shoulder and spinning him from his saddle. The battle that followed was brief but savage. The bounty hunter proved to be as dangerous as Marcus had feared, using the terrain expertly to close the distance while Jesse Crawford provided covering fire. Rebecca found herself face to face with the wounded Frank Crawford when he crawled around the rocks, bleeding but still determined to complete his mission. The derringer bucked in her hands as she fired, the small pistol's report almost lost in the echoing rifle shots. Frank Crawford's eyes widened in surprise, then went blank as he toppled backward onto the rocky ground. Rebecca stared at the body, shocked by how quickly life could end, how easily a human being could become just another. Shadow on the stone. Marcus's military training served him well in the firefight. He used every piece of cover, conserved ammunition, and waited for clear shots rather than wasting bullets on desperate attempts. When the bounty hunter made a final rush from an unexpected angle, Marcus was ready. His shot took the man's center mass, ending the threat with grim efficiency. Jesse Crawford, seeing both his companions down, made the mistake of breaking cover in panic. He ran for his horse, abandoning the fight in favor of escape. Marcus let him go. One survivor to carry word back to Morrison would serve their purposes better than three dead men who might simply disappear without explanation. The silence that followed the gunfight was profound, broken only by the wind through the rocks and the nervous stamping of their horses. Rebecca sat staring at Frank Crawford's body, her hands shaking uncontrollably as the reality of violence settled over her like a suffocating blanket. You did what you had to do, Marcus said gently, taking the empty derringer from her nerveless fingers. He would have killed you without hesitation. I know, she whispered, but knowing and doing, they're different things, Marcus understood. He'd killed his first man during the Apache campaigns, a young warrior who'd been trying to scalp a wounded soldier. The necessity hadn't made it easier, hadn't erased the image that still haunted his dreams decades later. They couldn't linger at the scene. Jesse Crawford would ride hard for Millbrook, carrying news of the fight and his brother's death. Morrison would respond with overwhelming force, sending every available man to hunt them down before they could reach safety. Can you ride? Marcus asked as he helped Rebecca to her feet. She nodded, though her face was gray with pain and shock. How much? Farther, 2 hours to the pass, then 3 more to Cascade Falls. He helped her into the saddle, noticing the way she favored her injured ribs. Think you can manage? I have to. They left the bodies where they'd fallen and pushed hard for the high country. The trail grew steeper and more treacherous, winding through boulder fields and across exposed slopes where a wrong step could send horse and rider tumbling into oblivion. Rebecca gritted her teeth against the pain, focusing on the rhythm of her horse's movement and the promise of safety that lay beyond the mountains. The pass itself was a narrow notch between towering peaks, barely wide enough for the trail that switched back through loose scree and weathered granite. Marcus kept glancing back, watching for pursuit, but the rugged terrain that made their escape difficult would slow any followers as well. As they crested the divide, the landscape opened before them like a different world. The eastern slopes were gentler, covered with meadows and forests that rolled down toward distant valleys. Somewhere in that green expanse lay Cascade Falls and the telegraph connection that could bring federal law to bear on Morrison's criminal empire. Beautiful. Rebecca breathed, momentarily forgetting her pain as she took in the vista. Sarah always said this was God's country, Marcus replied. Far enough from civilization to stay pure, close enough to remember why it matters. The descent was easier on the horses, but harder on Rebecca's injuries. Each jarring step sent fresh waves of agony through her broken ribs, and the stress of the morning's violence had left her emotionally drained. Marcus watched her carefully, ready to call a halt if she couldn't continue, but knowing that stopping now might doom them. Both. It was mid-afternoon when they finally saw the smoke rising from Cascade Falls chimneys. The town was smaller then. Millbrook, perhaps 50 buildings clustered around a sawmill and a general store. But it represented something precious, neutral ground where Morrison's influence couldn't reach, where honest law still meant something. Martha Thompson proved to be a woman of 45 with kind eyes and capable hands. Traits that reminded Marcus painfully of Sarah. She asked no questions when he arrived with a battered woman and a story about needing to send urgent telegrams. Simply ushered Rebecca inside and began tending her injuries with gentle competence. David's at the telegraph office, she told Marcus as she helped Rebecca into a hot bath. Tell him it's family business. He'll make sure your messages get through without too many questions. The telegraph office was a small building attached to the railroad station, filled with the clicking of the key and the smell of hot metal and electricity. David Thompson was a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles who looked up expectantly when Marcus entered. Need to send word to Colorado Springs, Marcus said without preamble. Federal marshal business. David's eyebrows rose, but he simply pulled out a message form. What do you want to say? Marcus dictated carefully, choosing his words to convey urgency without revealing too much over unsecured lines. The message would reach Marshal Henderson by evening, requesting an immediate meeting at a location far from Morrison's territory. If Henderson was the honest lawman his reputation suggested, he'd respond quickly to reports of corruption and murder in a frontier town. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Marcus and Rebecca sat in Martha's kitchen sharing their first peaceful meal in days. The immediate danger had passed, but they both knew the real battle was just beginning. Morrison will come, Rebecca said quietly. When Jesse Crawford tells him what happened, he'll know I'm alive and moving toward federal authority. He can't. Let me reach Marshal Henderson. Marcus nodded grimly. Then we'd better make sure Henderson reaches us first. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed through the valleys. The sound carried a promise of connection to the wider world, of justice that transcended the petty tyrannies of frontier towns. The third part of their story was ending, but the most dangerous chapters lay ahead. Morrison's empire was built on fear and isolation, on the belief that no one would care enough to challenge his authority. Tomorrow would test whether that belief could survive contact with federal law, and the testimony of a woman who'd crawled out from under his gallows with fire in her heart. Jesse Crawford's horse collapsed 3 miles outside Millbrook, foam streaming from its mouth and sides heaving like bellows. The animal had been pushed beyond endurance in Crawford's desperate flight from the mountain pass, and now it lay dying in the dust while Jesse stumbled the remaining distance on foot, his brother's blood still staining his shirt. Sheriff Caleb Morrison was cleaning his rifle on the jailhouse porch when Crawford staggered into view, babbling about gunfights and death, and the impossible survival of a woman who should have been feeding crows beneath the gallows. Morrison's face remained impassive as he listened to the panicked account, but inside, cold fury was building like pressure in a boiler. "You're telling me that Frank is dead," Morrison said when Crawford finished his rambling story. "That some rancher outgunned a professional bounty hunter and a Crawford in open combat." "It wasn't open, Sheriff. They had cover, rocks everywhere. And the woman she shot Frank herself, close range, never even hesitated." Jesse's voice cracked as he relived the moment. "She looked him right in the eyes and pulled that trigger like she was born to it." Morrison stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. "Where?" "Devil's Pass, maybe 10 miles up the canyon trail. Bodies are still there, unless the wolves found them first." The sheriff's mind was already calculating distances and possibilities. Devil's Pass commanded the eastern approach to the territory, the route anyone would take heading toward Colorado Springs and federal authority. If the woman had survived, if she'd found help, she would be seeking exactly that, someone beyond Morrison's reach who might listen to her accusations. "Get Doc Peterson to look at that shoulder," Morrison ordered. "Then gather every man we can trust. I want 20 riders ready to move within the hour." As Crawford limped toward the doctor's office, Morrison retreated into the jailhouse and locked the door behind him. In the back room, behind a false wall that appeared to be solid stone, lay the records of his true operations. Ledgers that detailed years of theft, extortion, and murder. Maps showing the locations of graves, the routes used to transport victims, the hiding places where stolen goods waited for buyers from Denver and Santa Fe. Morrison had always known this day might come when his carefully constructed empire would face a threat he couldn't eliminate through simple violence. He'd prepared for it, establishing escape routes and emergency funds, cultivating contacts in Mexico who would welcome a man with his particular skills. But he'd never imagined the threat would come from a beaten woman who should have died quietly. Beneath his gallows, the telegraph key began clicking in the corner office, and Morrison froze. David Thompson was sending messages again, the second burst of activity in 24 hours. Morrison couldn't read the code, but the timing was too convenient to be coincidence. Someone was calling for help, sending word beyond the mountains to authorities who might actually respond. In Cascade Falls, Rebecca sat by Martha's kitchen window, watching the railroad tracks that disappeared into the eastern distance. Every train whistle made her heart race with hope and fear. That Marshal Henderson was racing toward them with federal authority. Fear that Morrison's riders would arrive first with guns and rope. "The marshal will come," Martha said gently, refilling Rebecca's coffee cup. "David's messages always get through, and Henderson has a reputation for moving fast when corruption is involved." Marcus appeared in the doorway, rifle in hand and worry etched across his weathered features. "David says there's been unusual telegraph activity from Millbrook. Short bursts, coded messages, nothing he can decipher without federal clearance." Rebecca felt ice form in her stomach. "Morrison's calling for reinforcements. Looks that way. Question is whether he's bringing in local muscle or reaching out to contacts in other territories." Marcus sat across from her, his expression grim. "Either way, we need to assume he'll be here in force before Henderson can arrive." The afternoon passed with agonizing slowness. Rebecca tried to rest, but sleep eluded her as images of Frank Crawford's dying eyes mingled with memories of Morrison's cold smile. Martha bustled around the house, preparing spare rooms and checking supplies with the efficiency of someone who'd sheltered travelers through previous troubles. As evening approached, David burst through the kitchen door with news that changed everything. "Federal marshals coming on the night freight," he announced breathlessly. "Due in 3 hours, with a full investigative team and territorial authority to arrest anyone involved in the charges you've made." Rebecca felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. Henderson believed the telegrams? More than that. Turns out there have been complaints about Millbrook for months. Reports from families in Denver and Colorado Springs who lost contact with relatives who'd moved there. Your testimony was the missing piece that tied it all together. But Marcus remained troubled. 3 hours is a long time. If Morrison's riding hard, he could be here before the marshal arrives. As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses echoed from the western trail. Not the measured pace of travelers, but the urgent rhythm of men with deadly purpose. Martha extinguished the kitchen lamps and peered through the curtains, counting shapes moving through the twilight. 8 riders, she whispered. Maybe 10. They're spreading out, surrounding the house. Marcus checked his rifle and moved to the front window. In the gathering darkness, he could see men dismounting and taking positions behind barns and outbuildings. Professional deployment, the kind that spoke of military experience or extensive practice at this particular type of operation. Morrison's. Not with them, Rebecca observed, recognizing the lead rider as one of the sheriff's regular enforcers. He's too smart to risk himself on something this dangerous. A voice called from the darkness, amplified by a speaking trumpet that gave it an official commanding tone. "Thompson, we know you're harboring a fugitive wanted for theft and murder in Millbrook. Send the woman out and no one else needs to get hurt." Marcus positioned himself where he could cover the front door and most of the yard. "What theft? What? Murder? Rebecca Walsh stands accused of killing Deputy Frank Crawford and stealing territorial funds from the Millbrook schoolhouse. Sheriff Morrison has sworn out warrants, all legal and proper." The lies were smoothly delivered, backed by official-sounding language that might convince anyone who didn't know the truth. Morrison had used the hours since Jesse Crawford's return to manufacture evidence, create documentation, and transform the victim into villain with the stroke of a pen. 40 minutes, David whispered from his position with the telegraph key. "Marshall's train is 40 minutes out." Marcus made his decision. "We hold here until federal authority arrives. No negotiations, no surrender." The siege that followed tested everyone's resolve. Morrison's men probed the defenses, firing occasional shots to keep the defenders pinned down while avoiding the kind of all-out assault that might leave too many bodies to explain away. They were professionals, patient, and methodical content. To wait for dawn when they could see targets clearly and overwhelm the house through superior numbers. Rebecca found herself thinking about her father's lessons on frontier survival, wisdom passed down from his own days as a territorial surveyor. "Never give up the high ground," he'd always said. "And never surrender to men who've already proven they can't be trusted." Martha proved surprisingly capable with a rifle, taking a position upstairs where she could cover the back approaches. "Raised 4 sons before they all headed west," she explained when Marcus expressed surprise. "Had to teach them to shoot straight, and you can't teach what you don't know yourself." The attacker's first serious assault came just after midnight. 3 men rushed the front porch while others provided covering fire, hoping to breach the door and end the standoff quickly. Marcus met them with devastating accuracy, his army training evident in every shot. 2 attackers fell before reaching the steps, and the third retreated with a shattered shoulder. "Professional soldiers," Marcus observed grimly. "This isn't random violence Morrison's called in experienced men." The lull that followed stretched nerves to the breaking point. Rebecca crouched beside a window, Derringer reloaded and ready, watching shadows move through Martha's garden. Every sound made her jump. Every shift in the wind brought fear that attackers were closing in. Then David's telegraph key exploded into frantic activity. Messages flooded in from Colorado Springs, from Denver, from territorial headquarters in multiple locations. The federal response was larger than anyone had anticipated, involving multiple agencies and jurisdictions. "It's not just Henderson," David reported excitedly. "Treasury investigators, territorial marshals, even Army intelligence. Morrison's operation was bigger than we knew. They've been tracking him for months." A new voice called from the darkness. Different from the earlier demands. Younger, more educated, carrying the unmistakable authority of federal law. "This is Deputy Marshal William Patterson, Territorial Authority. You men are ordered to withdraw immediately and surrender your weapons." The response was a rifle shot that shattered the marshal's speaking trumpet. Morrison's men had committed themselves too deeply to back down now. Regardless of federal intervention, they were trapped between their employer's vengeance and the law's justice. With no escape except through violence, the final battle erupted. Just before dawn, as the first freight train in 3 days whistled its approach to Cascade Falls Station, Patterson led a coordinated assault with 6 federal deputies, while Morrison's remaining men made their last desperate attempt to silence Rebecca before she could testify. The gunfight raged through Martha's Garden and into the streets of Cascade Falls itself. Rebecca found herself face to face with Jesse Crawford, who'd ridden with the assault team seeking personal revenge for his brother's death. This time she didn't hesitate. The Derringer spoke twice, and Crawford joined his brother in whatever judgment awaited men who'd sold their souls for another man's profit. When the smoke cleared and the federal marshals had secured the scene, 5 of Morrison's men lay dead, and 3 others sat with shackled hands awaiting transport to territorial prison. The attackers who'd escaped melted back into the mountains, leaderless and demoralized. No longer a threat to anyone, Marshal Henderson proved to be a tall man, with kind eyes and the weathered hands of someone who'd spent years bringing law to lawless places. He listened to Rebecca's full testimony with careful attention, taking notes and asking questions that demonstrated both intelligence and genuine concern for justice. Morrison himself wasn't with the assault team, Henderson observed when Rebecca finished her account. Smart man, covering his tracks, maintaining plausible deniability. Marcus cleaned his rifle methodically as he spoke. He'll claim his men acted without orders, that he was investigating reports of fugitives and his deputies exceeded their authority. Probably, Henderson agreed. But we've got testimony, physical evidence, and federal jurisdiction now. Morrison's days of hiding behind a badge are over. Rebecca felt exhaustion washing over her like a tide, the accumulated stress of days finally taking its toll. She'd survived Morrison's gallows, escaped his hunters, fought his assassins, and lived to tell the truth to someone with the power to act on it. The nightmare was ending, but she knew the real work of justice was just beginning. What happens next? She asked. Henderson smiled grimly. Next, we pay Sheriff Morrison a visit he'll never forget. And you, Miss Walsh, get to watch a corrupt lawman face the same justice he denied to so many others. Outside, the sun rose over mountains that seemed cleaner somehow, as if the night's violence had washed away years of accumulated darkness. The 4th part of their story was ending, but Rebecca could feel the weight of justice finally beginning to tip in the right direction. Morrison's empire was crumbling, and soon the man who'd left her to die beneath his gallows would learn what it meant to face judgment from those who couldn't be bought, intimidated, or killed. Sheriff Caleb Morrison stood at his office window, watching the smoke rise from distant cooking fires as Millbrook awakened to what he knew would be its final day under his rule. The silence from his assault team told him everything he needed to know. Federal law had arrived in force, and his carefully constructed empire was collapsing like a house built on shifting sand. The telegraph had been quiet since dawn, but Morrison's network of informants throughout the territory had been sending riders with increasingly desperate reports. Federal marshals were converging on the region from 3 directions. Treasury agents had seized bank records in Colorado Springs. Army intelligence units were interviewing witnesses in Denver and Santa Fe, following paper trails that led inexorably back to Millbrook. Morrison opened the hidden safe behind his desk and began destroying documents with methodical precision. 20 years of corruption, theft, and murder reduced to ash in the cast-iron stove that heated his office. Each ledger page that curled and blackened represented fortunes stolen, lives destroyed, families erased from existence. He felt no remorse, only the cold calculation of a predator whose hunting ground had finally been discovered. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made him pause in his work. Multiple riders moving at the steady pace of men who had all the time in the world and the authority to use it however they chose. Morrison straightened his badge, checked his appearance in the cracked mirror beside his gun rack, and prepared to play his final role as the lawman he'd pretended to be for so long, Marshal. Henderson led the federal column into Millbrook with the casual confidence of someone who'd faced corrupt sheriffs before and always emerged victorious. Behind him rode Deputy Marshal Patterson, 3 territorial investigators, 2 Treasury agents, and a stenographer whose job would be to record every word of Morrison's eventual confession. Rebecca rode beside Marcus near the rear of the group. Her testimony already sworn and witnessed, her role as victim transformed into that of prosecutor. The bruises on her face had faded to yellow and green, but the fire in her eyes burned brighter than ever. She'd come full circle, returning to the town where Morrison had tried to murder her beneath his gallows. Remember, Henderson had told her during the ride from Cascade Falls, Morrison will try to discredit you, claim you're lying for revenge or money. Don't let him provoke you into anger. Truth speaks loudest when it's delivered calmly. The streets of Millbrook seemed smaller than Rebecca remembered, shabbier and more desperate. Windows slammed shut as the federal column passed, and citizens scurried into buildings like mice fleeing approaching cats. The fear Morrison had cultivated for years still controlled the town. Even with federal authority arriving to challenge it, Morrison emerged from the jailhouse as the column drew to a halt in the town square. He walked with unhurried dignity to Tutuco. Meet them, his badge catching the morning sunlight and his face arranged in an expression of confused cooperation. To anyone watching, he appeared to be exactly what he claimed, a dedicated peace officer greeting fellow lawmen with professional courtesy. "Gentlemen," Morrison said pleasantly, touching the brim of his hat, "I'm Sheriff Caleb Morrison. I assume you're here about the fugitive reports I've been sending. Glad to see federal law taking an interest in territorial crime." Henderson dismounted, slowly, his eyes never leaving Morrison's face. "Actually, Sheriff, we're here about you." The words hung in the morning air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Morrison's expression didn't change, but Rebecca noticed the slight tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible shift in his stance. He was calculating odds, measuring distances, preparing for whatever came next. "I'm afraid I don't understand." Morrison replied, "Has there been some mistake in my reports? Some confusion about jurisdictional authority?" Patterson stepped forward with a leather portfolio thick with documents. "Caleb Morrison, you're under arrest for murder, theft of federal funds, conspiracy, kidnapping, and abuse of office under color of law. You have the right to remain silent." Morrison's laugh was genuine, rich with amusement that seemed completely unforced. "This is remarkable. What evidence could you possibly have for such extraordinary charges?" Henderson gestured toward Rebecca, who urged her horse forward until she was close enough to see the recognition dawn in Morrison's eyes. The sheriff's face went through a series of subtle changes: surprise, calculation, and finally a cold rage that transformed his features into something inhuman. "Miss Rebecca Walsh," Henderson announced formally. "Victim of your attempted murder, witness to your criminal enterprise, and holder of documentation that details years of corruption under your administration." Morrison studied Rebecca with the intensity of a predator examining unexpected prey. I see a disturbed woman making wild accusations against a duly elected peace officer. Miss Walsh was dismissed from her teaching position for theft and inappropriate conduct. She attacked my deputies and fled justice like the criminal she is. That would be a compelling defense, Patterson said mildly, if we hadn't found the graves. The effect was immediate and devastating. Morrison's carefully maintained composure cracked, revealing the monster beneath the badge. His hand moved instinctively toward his gun, stopped only by the sight of 6 federal weapons already trained on him. "The meadow north of town," Rebecca said quietly. 23 graves, Sheriff. Men, women, children. People who trusted you to protect them, who believed your badge meant something. Morrison's voice turned venomous. "You can't prove anything. Dead men tell no tales, and buried secrets stay buried." Henderson smiled grimly. "Army engineers have been excavating that meadow for 2 days. We've identified 7 victims so far, including 3 children. The territorial governor has declared this a federal crime scene under emergency jurisdiction." The townspeople had begun emerging from their hiding places, drawn by the confrontation unfolding in their square. Rebecca recognized faces from her teaching days, parents whose children she'd educated, merchants she'd bought supplies from, ordinary people who'd lived in fear for years without understanding why. "You told them I was dead," Rebecca called out, her voice carrying clearly across the square. "You said I'd stolen money and run away in shame. But here I am, alive despite your best efforts, ready to tell the truth about what you've done to this town." An elderly woman stepped forward from the crowd, her face wet with tears. "My daughter Emma," she said to Henderson. "She disappeared 8 months ago. Morrison said she'd run off with a traveling salesman, but she'd never leave without telling me." More voices joined hers, people finding courage they'd forgotten they possessed. Families began recounting the disappearances Morrison had explained away, the mysterious accidents that had befallen anyone who asked too many questions, the climate of fear that had settled over Millbrook like a plague. Morrison listened to the accumulating testimony with growing desperation. His empire of terror was dissolving in broad daylight, exposed to federal scrutiny that would leave no crime unpunished, no victim forgotten. "Lies," he snarled. "All of it. These people are frightened, confused, willing to believe any story that explains their troubles." Henderson nodded to Patterson, who began reading formal charges from an official document. Each accusation was supported by evidence, witness testimony, and physical proof that Morrison's denials couldn't challenge. The case against him was overwhelming, built not just on Rebecca's testimony, but on months of federal investigation. The Treasury Department has identified over $200,000 in stolen territorial funds, Patterson announced. Bank records show systematic theft dating back 5 years, with money transferred to accounts in Denver, Santa Fe, and Mexico City. Morrison's face had gone pale, but he maintained his defiant stance. Banking records can be forged. Federal agents have been known to manufacture evidence when they need convictions. What about this? Rebecca dismounted and walked to within 10 feet of Morrison, close enough to see the fear beginning to replace his arrogance. From her coat, she produced a small leather journal, its pages filled with her careful handwriting. Every disappearance, every mysterious death, every family that vanished in the night, she said. Names, dates, descriptions of the men who came to take them away. "I watched from my schoolhouse window, Sheriff. I documented everything." Morrison's eyes fixed on the journal with predatory intensity. "You couldn't have seen anything from the school. It's too far from the residential area." The words escaped him before he could stop them, and Rebecca smiled with grim satisfaction. "I never said which window I watched from, Sheriff. How would you know the school's location relative to the crimes, unless you'd planned the attacks from there?" Henderson nodded approvingly. Morrison had just confirmed details only the perpetrator would know, undermining his own defense with a single careless sentence. The crowd had grown larger, with people emerging from shops and houses to witness their tormentors' downfall. Among them, Rebecca spotted several faces she didn't recognize, federal agents positioned throughout the town, ensuring that no armed supporters could intervene on Morrison's behalf. "You have a choice," Henderson told Morrison. "Surrender peacefully and cooperate with our investigation, or resist arrest and face additional charges of interfering with federal officers." Morrison's hand hovered near his gun, but he was outnumbered 20-1 by armed professionals who'd shown they wouldn't hesitate to use force. His shoulders sagged as the reality of his situation penetrated his desperate calculations. "This isn't over," he said quietly, looking directly at Rebecca. "You think killing me will bring back the dead? You think federal law can undo what's been done?" "No," Rebecca replied. "But it can prevent you from doing it again." The arrest itself was anticlimactic. Morrison submitted to shackles without resistance, his rage replaced by the cold calculation of a man already planning his next move. He knew territorial law, understood the appeals process, had connections throughout the criminal justice system that might yet save him from the gallows. As federal agents began searching the jailhouse and Morrison's private quarters, they uncovered evidence that exceeded even Rebecca's documentation. Hidden rooms contained stolen goods, forged documents, and detailed maps showing the locations of graves throughout the territory. Morrison's operation had been far larger than anyone suspected. 27 bodies recovered so far, Patterson reported as the search continued. Ages ranging from 8 to 63. Some show signs of violence, others appear to have been poisoned or drugged. The scope of Morrison's crimes stunned even the federal investigators. This wasn't simple corruption or opportunistic theft. It was systematic murder on a scale that qualified as territorial terrorism. Entire families had been eliminated to prevent witnesses, children killed to ensure silence, elderly victims targeted for their accumulated savings. Rebecca found herself thinking about her prayer beneath the gallows, her plea that her death might mean something. God had answered in ways she couldn't have imagined, transforming her near murder into the catalyst that would expose decades of evil and bring justice to countless victims. As afternoon shadows lengthened across Millbrook Square, the full extent of Morrison's network became clear. Telegraph messages revealed connections to criminal organizations in 6 territories, a web of corruption that had operated for years without federal detection. Morrison hadn't just terrorized one town, he'd been part of a larger conspiracy that had claimed hundreds of lives. "The trial will be in Denver," Henderson told Rebecca as federal agents prepared to transport Morrison to a territorial prison. "Federal court, federal judge, federal jury. No chance of local intimidation or corruption." Rebecca nodded, though she felt no satisfaction in Morrison's capture. Too many people had died, too many families destroyed, too many children who would never return home. Justice could punish the guilty, but it couldn't resurrect the innocent. Marcus appeared beside her as Morrison was loaded into the prison wagon. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Empty," she said honestly. "I thought I'd feel triumphant, but mostly I just feel tired." Morrison raised his shackled hands to his forehead in a mocking salute as the wagon began to move. "See you in Denver, miss." "Walsh," he called. "Federal trials can be unpredictable." The threat was clear, and Henderson frowned. "We'll provide protection during the trial proceedings. Morrison still has allies who might try to silence you before you can testify." As the federal column prepared to depart Millbrook, taking Morrison toward justice and carrying evidence of his crimes, Rebecca stood in the town square where her ordeal had begun. The gallows still loomed overhead, its rope swaying in the afternoon breeze, a reminder of how close she'd come to becoming another of Morrison's forgotten victims. The 5th part of their story was ending, but Rebecca knew the most dangerous chapter still lay ahead. Morrison was captured but not convicted, removed from power but not yet punished. The real test would come in Denver's federal courthouse, where her testimony would either condemn a monster or set him free to kill again. The Denver federal courthouse rose from the city's heart like a temple to justice, its marble columns gleaming white against the autumn sky. Rebecca stood on the steps, feeling dwarfed by the magnitude of the building and the weight of what lay ahead. 3 weeks had passed since Morrison's arrest. 3 weeks of preparation, coaching, and sleepless nights haunted by dreams of Gallows. Ropes and cold courtroom eyes. Marcus stood beside her, his presence a steadying force in the chaos of legal proceedings. He'd refused federal offers of protection, choosing instead to hire private guards from his own fund's men he'd served with. During the Apache campaigns, soldiers whose loyalty couldn't be bought or intimidated. "Remember what the prosecutor told you," Marcus said quietly as they climbed the courthouse steps. "Tell the truth simply, answer only what's asked, and don't let Morrison's lawyer provoke you into anger." Rebecca nodded, though her stomach churned. With nervous energy, Federal Prosecutor James Whitman had spent days preparing her testimony, drilling her on facts and dates until she could recite Morrison's crimes like a prayer. But knowing the facts and facing Morrison across a courtroom were different challenges entirely. The courtroom itself was packed beyond capacity, with spectators overflowing into the corridors and journalists from newspapers across the territory, scribbling notes in preparation for stories that would reach from Colorado to California. Word of Morrison's crimes had spread like wildfire, transforming a local corruption case into a national symbol of frontier justice. Judge Harrison Blackwood commanded the proceedings with the gravity of someone who'd presided over territorial law for 30 years. His weathered face showed no emotion as he called the court to order. But Rebecca had been told he'd lost his own brother to corrupt lawmen in Kansas, a fact that gave her hope for impartial justice. Morrison sat at the defendant's table wearing a clean suit and freshly trimmed beard, his appearance transformed from frontier sheriff to respectable gentleman. His lawyer, Charles Rothschild, was reputed to be the finest criminal defense attorney between Chicago and San Francisco. A man who'd never lost a capital case and specialized in defending corrupt officials. "The prosecution will prove," Whitman began in his opening statement, "that Caleb Morrison systematically murdered 27 innocent people over a period of 5 years, stealing territorial funds, corrupting federal offices, and operating a criminal conspiracy that extends across multiple jurisdictions." Rothschild's response was smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you will hear the desperate lies of a disturbed woman who attacked peace officers and fled justice. Rebecca Walsh is a thief, a fantasist, and a murderer who killed 2 lawmen in cold blood and now seeks to escape punishment by accusing her victims of imaginary crimes." The first day of testimony focused on evidence bank records, telegraph communications, physical artifacts recovered from Morrison's hidden rooms. Treasury Agent Michael Sullivan presented financial documents showing the systematic theft of territorial funds, money that had been diverted to accounts controlled by Morrison and his associates. Rebecca watched Morrison's face during Sullivan's testimony, looking for signs of concern or fear. Instead, she saw only cold calculation, the expression of a man confident that money and legal skill could overcome any evidence against him. He took notes constantly, whispering instructions to Rothschild with the authority of someone directing his own defense. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the territorial coroner who'd examined the recovered bodies, provided testimony that made several jurors visibly uncomfortable. 27 victims, she stated clearly. Causes of death include gunshot wounds, strangulation, blunt force trauma, and poisoning. Several showed signs of prolonged torture before death. Rothschild's cross-examination was brutal. "Dr. Harper, how many of these alleged victims can you positively identify?" 14 have been confirmed through dental records, personal effects, and family identification. "And the remaining 13? remain unidentified due to decomposition and ... So you're asking this jury to convict my client of murdering 13 people you can't even name? Rothschild's voice carried the perfect tone of reasonable doubt. Bodies found in unmarked graves with no proof of when they died or who killed them. Rebecca felt her heart sink as she watched the jury's faces. Rothschild was methodically dismantling the prosecution's case, creating doubt where certainty should have existed, transforming clear evidence into ambiguous possibilities. Marshall Henderson's testimony on the second day provided crucial context about Morrison's criminal network. We've identified connections to organized crime syndicates in 6 territories, he explained. Morrison wasn't operating alone. He was part of a larger conspiracy to eliminate federal authority in remote regions. But Rothschild attacked Henderson's credibility with surgical precision. Marshall, how many corrupt sheriffs have you arrested in your career? 43. And how many of those convictions were overturned on appeal? Henderson's hesitation was barely perceptible, but Rothschild pounced on it. 12, Henderson admitted. Nearly 30%. Would you say your department has a history of rushing to judgment against local peace officers? The questioning continued for hours, with Rothschild systematically undermining every piece of evidence, every witness, every connection the prosecution had painstakingly constructed. He was a master craftsman of reasonable doubt, transforming Morrison from obvious criminal into possible victim of federal overreach. Rebecca's moment finally came on the third day. She walked to the witness stand feeling the weight of every eye. In the courtroom, knowing that her words would determine whether justice prevailed or evil escaped to kill again. Morrison watched her with predatory intensity, his lips curved in the faintest suggestion of a smile. Whitman led her through her testimony with careful precision. Rebecca described her arrival in Millbrook, her work as a teacher, her growing awareness of the disappearances that plagued the town. She detailed the creation of her journal, the discovery of the hidden graveyard, Morrison's brutal assault and attempted murder. Miss Walsh, Whitman said gently, can you identify the man? Who ordered your execution beneath the gallows? Rebecca looked directly at Morrison, seeing no remorse in his cold eyes. Sheriff Caleb Morrison. He told me I was going to hang until I died. Then he would claim I'd committed suicide out of shame. The courtroom was absolutely silent as Rebecca described her night beneath the gallows, the prayer that had sustained her through those terrible hours, the miracle of Marcus finding her before death claimed another victim. Several jurors were visibly moved, and even Judge Blackwood seemed affected by her testimony. But Rothschild's cross-examination was devastating. Miss Walsh, you've admitted to killing 2 men during your flight from justice. Isn't it true that you're testifying to avoid prosecution for those murders? I killed them in self-defense. They were trying to ... Please answer the question. Have federal authorities offered you immunity from prosecution in exchange for your testimony? Rebecca felt trapped. Yes, but... So you have a direct financial and legal incentive to lie about my client? I'm telling the truth. Rothschild smiled coldly. The truth, according to a woman who, by her own admission, has killed 2 peace officers and fabricated elaborate stories to justify her crimes. The attack continued for 3 hours. Rothschild methodically destroyed Rebecca's credibility, painting her as a delusional killer who'd constructed an elaborate fantasy to escape responsibility for her actions. He presented evidence of her dismissal from previous teaching positions, suggested she'd stolen money from the Millbrook School Fund, implied she'd seduced and murdered the Crawford brothers when they discovered her crimes. By the time Rothschild finished, Rebecca felt as though she'd been flayed alive. The jury's faces showed confusion and doubt, their earlier sympathy replaced by suspicion. Morrison's smile had grown wider, and she could see him savoring her humiliation. The prosecution's rebuttal focused on physical evidence, the hidden graves, the stolen money, the documented pattern of disappearances. But Rothschild had poisoned the well of credibility, creating enough doubt to potentially save his client from the gallows. On the fourth day, Morrison took the stand in his own defense. He was magnificent, confident, articulate, presenting himself as a dedicated peace officer who'd spent years fighting crime in a lawless territory. He denied every accusation with convincing sincerity, explaining away evidence with reasonable alternative theories. "I've dedicated my life to bringing law and order to the frontier," Morrison testified. "Miss Walsh represents everything I've fought against: criminals who use false accusations to escape justice, who prey on good people's sympathy to avoid punishment for their crimes." Whitman's cross-examination revealed Morrison's true nature only in glimpses. The man was too skilled, too prepared, too intelligent to be easily trapped. He admitted to no crimes, showed no remorse, maintained his innocence with the confidence of someone who'd evaded justice for years. But then Whitman asked the question that changed everything. "Mr. Morrison, you've testified that you never met Miss Walsh before her arrest. Is that correct?" "That's correct." "You had no knowledge of her activities, no surveillance of her movements?" "None whatsoever." Whitman approached the defense table, carrying a leather-bound ledger recovered from Morrison's hidden safe. "Then how do you explain this entry from your personal journal, dated 3 weeks before Miss Walsh's arrest? Teacher is becoming problematic. Observing from the schoolhouse roof, documenting our operations. Must be eliminated before federal contact established." Morrison's face went white. In the careful destruction of evidence before his arrest, he'd missed one crucial document: his own handwritten notes detailing surveillance of Rebecca and plans for her murder. That's not." Morrison's composure finally cracked, revealing the monster beneath the badge. "That ledger could have been forged. Federal agents have been known to." "Your Honor," Whitman interrupted, "I present additional evidence. Handwriting analysis by 3 independent experts confirms this journal was written by the defendant over a period of several years." The courtroom erupted as Morrison's carefully constructed defense collapsed. The journal contained detailed plans for multiple murders, financial records of stolen territorial funds, and maps showing the locations of graves throughout the region. It was Morrison's own hand that condemned him, his meticulous record-keeping transformed into the instrument of his downfall. Rothschild called for recess, huddling with his client as the prosecution's case suddenly became overwhelming. Morrison's face showed the first real fear Rebecca had seen since his arrest, the realization that his string of legal victories was finally ending. The closing arguments lasted 6 hours. Whitman methodically presented the evidence, weaving Rebecca's testimony together with physical proof to create an unshakable case for Morrison's guilt. Rothschild fought desperately to maintain reasonable doubt, but the journal had destroyed his client's credibility beyond repair. Judge Blackwood's instructions to the jury were clear and precise. "You must determine whether the prosecution has proven beyond reasonable doubt that Caleb Morrison committed the crimes charged. The defendant's status as a peace officer provides no immunity from justice if he has violated the law he swore to uphold." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. "Guilty on all counts," the foreman announced. Morrison showed no emotion as Judge Blackwood pronounced the sentence. "Caleb Morrison, you have betrayed every principle of justice and law. You will hang by the neck until dead, sentenced to be carried out within 30 days. Rebecca felt no triumph, only exhaustion. Justice had been served, but the cost had been terrible: 27 innocent lives lost, families destroyed, a community terrorized for years. Morrison's death wouldn't bring back his victims, but it might prevent future atrocities. As federal marshals led Morrison from the courtroom in shackles, he passed close enough to Rebecca to whisper his final words to her. "You think this ends it? My associates will remember what you've done. This isn't over." But Rebecca had faced death beneath Morrison's gallows and survived. His threats no longer carried the power to terrify her. She'd found her voice, told her truth, and watched justice prevail despite overwhelming odds. The sixth part of their story was ending, but Rebecca knew the most important chapter was just beginning. Morrison would hang for his crimes, but the healing of the communities he'd terrorized would take years. She'd survived to see justice done, and now she had to decide how to use the rest of her life to honor those who hadn't been as fortunate. The morning of Caleb Morrison's execution dawned gray and cold, with Denver's mountain peaks shrouded in clouds that promised winter's first serious snow. Rebecca stood at the window of her hotel room, watching federal marshals secure the courthouse square where the gallows had been erected during the night. In 12 hours, the man who'd tried to murder her beneath his own gallows would face the same fate he'd imposed on so many others. She'd barely slept, her mind churning with memories of the trial and anticipation of closure that had been 3 months in coming. Morrison's appeals had failed spectacularly. The evidence was too overwhelming, his crimes too documented, his journal too damning for any court to overturn Judge Blackwood's verdict. Marcus knocked softly on her door, carrying a breakfast tray and the morning newspapers. "How are you feeling?" he asked, setting the food on the small table beside the window. "Strange," Rebecca admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. "I thought I'd feel triumphant, but mostly, I just feel hollow. 27 people are still dead, Marcus. Morrison hanging won't bring them back." Marcus nodded, understanding her conflict. The past months had changed both of them in ways they were still discovering. The quiet rancher who'd found her beneath the gallows had become a figure of national attention, invited to speak at law enforcement conferences and territorial governance meetings. Rebecca herself had received dozens of letters from women across the frontier, survivors of corruption and violence who'd drawn strength from her story. "The territorial governor wants to see you today," Marcus said, producing an official envelope from his coat. Something about a new position, a formal role in territorial law enforcement. Rebecca examined the letter with growing amazement. Governor Mitchell was offering her the newly created position of territorial victim advocate, a role that would allow her to investigate corruption and support witnesses in frontier communities where federal law struggled to maintain authority. "He wants me to do for other towns what we did for Millbrook," she realized. "Travel throughout the territory, document abuses, bring federal attention to places where local law has been corrupted." It was exactly the kind of meaningful work she'd dreamed of during her darkest hours beneath Morrison's gallows. Her near death had taught her that survival without purpose was just delayed dying. But survival with mission could transform tragedy into triumph. The execution was scheduled for sunset, but long before then, crowds began gathering in the courthouse square. Morrison had become a symbol to some of frontier justice finally prevailing, to others of federal overreach destroying local autonomy. Federal marshals maintained order, but the tension was palpable as supporters and opponents of the execution faced each other across the divided square. Rebecca spent the afternoon visiting with families of Morrison's victims, people who'd traveled from across the territory to witness their tormentors' final moments. Emma Patterson's mother wept when she thanked Rebecca for giving her daughter's death meaning. "I never thought I'd see justice," the elderly woman said. "Thought he'd killed her and gotten away with it forever." The stories were heartbreakingly similar: families destroyed by Morrison's greed, communities terrorized into silence, children who'd grown up thinking corruption was normal because they'd never known honest law enforcement. Rebecca listened to each account with growing determination to accept Governor Mitchell's offer to ensure that other Morrisons would be stopped before they could claim so many innocent lives. As afternoon faded toward evening, Rebecca and Marcus made their way to the courthouse square. Federal marshals had reserved a section for victims' families and witnesses, separating them from the general crowd and the handful of Morrison supporters who'd gathered near the platform. Morrison himself appeared calm as they led him from the courthouse to the gallows. He'd refused religious counsel, declined to make a final statement, and shown no remorse for the crimes that had earned him the rope. He wore the same black suit he'd worn during the trial, his bearing dignified despite the shackles on his wrists and ankles. Judge Black would read the death warrant in a voice that carried clearly across the square. Caleb Morrison, you have been found guilty of 27 counts of murder, conspiracy, theft of federal funds, and abuse of office. The sentence of this court is that you be hanged by the neck until dead, and may God have mercy on your soul. Morrison's eyes swept the crowd, finally settling on Rebecca. Even facing death, his gaze held no repentance, only the cold calculation of a predator who'd been caught but not tamed. He nodded slightly in her direction, not an acknowledgement of guilt, but a recognition of the woman who'd brought him down. The execution itself was swift and professional. Federal marshals had performed this grim duty many times, and they conducted themselves with the solemnity appropriate to the taking of life, even a life as forfeit as Morrison's. When the trap door opened and Morrison dropped into eternity, Rebecca felt no joy, only a profound sense that justice, delayed but not denied, had finally been served. But even as Morrison's body swayed in the evening breeze, Rebecca knew their story was far from over. During the trial, federal investigators uncovered evidence of Morrison's criminal network contacts in 6 territories, corrupt officials in dozens of towns, a conspiracy that had operated for years without federal detection. 3 days after the execution, Marshal Henderson arrived at Rebecca's hotel with disturbing news. "We've arrested Morrison's principal associate in New Mexico Territory," he reported. A sheriff named Carlos Vega, who was running the same operation Morrison pioneered in Colorado. But there are others, at least a dozen communities where similar patterns exist. Rebecca studied the map Henderson spread across her table, noting the locations marked with red ink. Each represented a town potentially under the control of corrupt lawmen, places where Morrison's model of systematic terror might still be claiming innocent lives. "The territorial governors are coordinating a response," Henderson continued. "Multiple investigations, federal oversight, new accountability measures. But it's going to take years to root out all the corruption Morrison helped spread." That evening, Rebecca made her decision. She would accept Governor Mitchell's offer, but with expanded authority to investigate corruption throughout the entire frontier region. Marcus had already agreed to accompany her, his military experience and her investigative skills, creating a partnership that could bring hope to communities that had lost faith in justice. Their first assignment came within a week. Reports of disappearances and unexplained deaths in a mining town called Silver Creek, 200 miles south of Denver. The pattern was familiar: a recently appointed sheriff, unusual numbers of accidents and disappearances, and a community too terrified to ask questions. As they prepared for the journey, Rebecca reflected on how much had changed since that terrible night beneath Morrison's gallows. She'd prayed for her death to have meaning, for someone to remember that she'd tried to do right. Instead, she'd been granted something far more valuable: the chance to live with purpose, to transform her survival into salvation for others facing similar darkness. The coach that would carry them to Silver Creek arrived on a crisp autumn morning, loaded with supplies and official documents that would give them authority to investigate local law enforcement. Rebecca carried her journal, a new one, dedicated to documenting the extent of frontier corruption and the progress of federal intervention. "Are you ready for this?" Marcus asked as they prepared to depart Denver. Rebecca looked back at the courthouse, where Morrison had faced justice, then ahead at the road that would take them to communities still trapped in the shadows of corrupt authority. "I've been ready since the moment you found me under those gallows," she said. "This is what I was saved to do." The first few months of their new mission tested both their resolve and their methods. Silver Creek proved to be every bit as corrupt as Morrison's Millbrook, with Sheriff Luis Montoya operating an identical scheme of murder and theft. But their investigation techniques, refined during the Morrison case, allowed them to gather evidence quickly and coordinate with federal authorities to ensure swift intervention. Rebecca discovered she had a talent for gaining the trust of frightened witnesses, while Marcus's military bearing commanded respect from honest lawmen and fear from corrupt ones. Together, they developed a system for identifying corruption, documenting crimes, and bringing federal law to bear on frontier tyranny. Their success in Silver Creek led to assignments in Wyoming Territory, where a sheriff named William Drake had been selling protection to rustlers and claim jumpers. Then to Arizona, where territorial authorities suspected systematic theft of Apache reservation supplies. Each case built their reputation and refined their methods, creating a model for frontier justice that other territorial governments began adopting. But perhaps their most important work was the quiet counseling Rebecca provided to victims and survivors. In every town they investigated, she found women and children who'd lived in fear for years, people who'd given up hope that justice was possible on the frontier. Her story became their inspiration, proof that even the most powerful corruption could be overcome by determined individuals willing to risk everything for truth. 2 years after Morrison's execution, Rebecca and Marcus returned to Millbrook for the dedication of a new territorial courthouse. The town had struggled to rebuild after Morrison's removal, with many residents relocating to communities with less violent histories. But those who remained had worked to create something better, a community dedicated to transparency, accountability, and the rule of law. The old gallows had been torn down, replaced by a memorial garden honoring Morrison's victims. 27 white stones bore the names of the identified dead, while a larger monument remembered the unknown victims whose families had never learned their fate. Rebecca placed white roses on each marker, a ritual that had become her personal tribute to those whose voices could no longer speak for justice. "Do you ever regret it?" Marcus asked as they stood in the memorial garden. Giving up the quiet life for all this traveling and investigating, Rebecca considered the question seriously. Their work was dangerous, often thankless, and emotionally exhausting. They'd faced death threats, assassination attempts, and constant pressure from corrupt officials who wanted them to abandon their mission. But they'd also saved lives, brought justice to forgotten victims, and helped establish federal oversight systems that were transforming frontier law enforcement. "I think about Sarah sometimes," Rebecca said, surprising him with the admission. "How she used her medical skills to help people, how she made your ranch a place of healing rather than just survival. In a way, we're doing the same thing, healing communities that have been poisoned by corruption." Marcus nodded, understanding her meaning. Sarah's spirit lived on not in memory alone, but in the choice to use their skills and experiences to serve something larger than themselves. Rebecca's survival beneath the gallows had given them both a second chance at meaningful life. Their final major case came 3 years after Morrison's execution, when territorial authorities asked them to investigate reports of a criminal conspiracy spanning multiple states. The evidence led them to Chicago, where they discovered that Morrison's network had been part of an even larger operation, a systematic effort to place corrupt officials throughout the frontier territories, creating zones of lawlessness where organized crime could operate without federal interference. The investigation took 8 months and ultimately involved federal authorities from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. 23 corrupt sheriffs were arrested, dozens of criminal enterprises were dismantled, and new oversight systems were established to prevent similar conspiracies from taking root. Rebecca's testimony before Congress led to the creation of the Federal Frontier Justice Commission, a permanent agency dedicated to monitoring territorial law enforcement and investigating corruption complaints. She was offered the position of chief investigator, a role that would base her in Washington with authority throughout the Western territories. But she declined the offer, choosing instead to return to Colorado with Marcus. They'd spent 3 years bringing justice to others, Now it was time to build something for themselves. They married in a simple ceremony in the church at Cascade Falls, with Martha Thompson serving as matron of honor and Marshall Henderson performing the civil portion of the service. The guest list included families of Morrison's victims, federal agents they'd worked with, and survivors from communities they'd helped restore to lawful governance. After the wedding, they returned to the Thompson Ranch where Rebecca established a school for the children of the scattered mountain communities. But this wasn't the traditional education she'd once provided. This was practical training in citizenship, law, and the rights guaranteed by territorial and federal constitutions. She taught children how to recognize corruption, how to report crimes to appropriate authorities, and how to stand up for justice even when local power opposed them. Marcus expanded the ranch to accommodate families who needed temporary shelter while testifying in corruption cases, or who required protection from retaliation after reporting criminal activity. The property became known throughout the territory as a safe haven for those seeking justice, a place where truth-tellers could find sanctuary and support. On quiet evenings, Rebecca would sit on the porch where she'd first awakened to Marcus's kindness, looking out at the mountains that had once seemed like barriers and now appeared to be guardians. The physical scars from Morrison's assault had faded, but the inner strength forged beneath his gallows remained as bright as ever. Sometimes she would think about that terrible night, about the prayer she'd whispered while expecting to die alone and forgotten. Lord, if this is where I die, let it mean something. Let someone remember that I tried to do right. Her prayer had been answered in ways she never could have imagined. Not only had someone remembered, someone had acted. Marcus had found her. When she was beyond hope, federal law had believed her when she was beyond credibility, and justice had prevailed when it seemed beyond possibility. But perhaps most importantly, her survival had meaning beyond her own life. Every corruption case they'd solved, every victim they'd helped find justice, every community they'd freed from criminal control, all of it grew from that moment beneath Morrison's gallows when she'd chosen to pray for meaning rather than revenge. The territory had changed as well. Where once corrupt sheriffs had ruled through fear and violence, new systems of accountability ensured that law enforcement served justice rather than personal profit. The Federal Frontier Justice Commission continued their work on a larger scale, investigating complaints and maintaining oversight that prevented the kind of systematic abuse Morrison had pioneered. Rebecca's journal, the one she'd kept during her darkest hours in Millbrook, had been preserved in the territorial archives as evidence of how ordinary citizens could document and expose even the most entrenched corruption. It served as inspiration for others facing similar circumstances, proof that truth carefully recorded could overcome even the most powerful lies. On the 5th anniversary of Morrison's execution, Rebecca received a letter that brought tears to her eyes. It was from a young woman in Montana Territory who'd used Rebecca's methods to document corruption in her own community, leading to the arrest of a sheriff who'd been stealing tribal land payments and selling women into forced labor. "Your story gave me courage when I thought I was alone," the woman wrote. "You showed me that survival is only the beginning, that what we do with our survival is what makes it meaningful. Thank you for proving that one person's voice, raised at the right moment, can change everything." Rebecca folded the letter carefully and placed it in the wooden box, where she kept similar correspondence from across the frontier. Dozens of letters from survivors who'd found strength in her story, from families who'd achieved justice for murdered loved ones, from communities that had thrown off the yoke of corrupt authority. Each letter was proof that her prayer beneath Morrison's gallows had been answered not once, but continuously. Her death had been transformed into life, not just her own, but the lives of countless others who'd found hope in her survival and courage in her example. That evening, as she and Marcus sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Rebecca reflected on the strange path that had led from Morrison's gallows to this moment of peace. The woman who'd been left to die beneath those ropes had found not just survival, but purpose. Not just justice, but meaning. Not just love, but a mission that would echo through generations. "What are you thinking about?" Marcus asked, noticing her contemplative silence. "How prayers get answered," Rebecca replied, taking his hand as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "Sometimes not at all. Sometimes in ways we never expected. And sometimes in ways that change everything. Not just for us, but for everyone whose lives we touch." Above them, the stars blinked with ancient light, witnesses to countless human struggles and triumphs. And somewhere in their celestial dance, Rebecca imagined she could see the faces of Morrison's victims, no longer forgotten, no longer without justice. Finally at peace because someone had survived to tell their stories, and someone had cared enough to listen. The final part of their story was ending, but Rebecca knew it was also beginning. Every day brought new opportunities to honor her survival. By serving others, to transform the darkness of her experience into light that could guide other lost souls toward justice and hope. The new approach proved remarkably effective. By training territorial deputies in investigation techniques and providing them with direct communication channels to federal authorities, Rebecca could coordinate multiple investigations simultaneously. While remaining at the ranch's relative safety, her reputation had grown beyond law enforcement circles. Eastern newspapers regularly featured stories about the woman who survived the gallows, and women's rights organizations invited her to speak about female participation in frontier justice. But Rebecca remained focused on practical work rather than celebrity, using her platform to advocate for legal reforms and improved law enforcement training. The Academy became a center for innovation in frontier education, with students and faculty developing new approaches to civic engagement and community organizing. Rebecca's teaching emphasized that democracy required active participation from ordinary citizens, that justice was not something delivered by distant authorities, but something created by people, willing to stand up for their principles. 10 years after Morrison's execution, President Harrison invited Rebecca to Washington to advise on territorial statehood requirements. The meeting took place in the White House, with Rebecca presenting detailed recommendations for ensuring that new states entered the Union with strong democratic institutions and effective law enforcement systems. "Your work has demonstrated that frontier communities can achieve the same standards of justice as our oldest cities," the president told her during their private meeting. "The systems you've helped establish will serve as models for territorial governance throughout our expansion westward." But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The Apache Nation formally adopted Rebecca as an honorary member of Ayana's clan, recognizing her role in exposing the corruption that had systematically stolen tribal lands and murdered native families. The ceremony took place during the Academy's annual graduation, with tribal elders presenting Rebecca with a medicine bundle that they said would protect her during continued travels. "You have walked the path of justice even when it led through darkness," the clan leader said during the ceremony. "Your survival beneath the white man's hanging tree was meant to serve the Great Spirit's purpose of protecting all people from those who would use power to harm rather than heal." The Academy's graduates were now scattered throughout the Western territories, serving as teachers, lawyers, journalists, and federal officials. They carried with them the principles Rebecca had developed from her own experience, that courage could overcome corruption, that individual action could create systemic change, and that survival without purpose was just delayed dying. Rebecca's journal from her Millbrook ordeal had been published by a Boston printing house, with proceeds funding scholarships for frontier students seeking legal education. The book became required reading in law schools across the country, studied as an example of how ordinary citizens could document and expose official corruption. But private moments remained the most precious. Summer evenings on the ranch porch, watching thunderstorms build over the mountains while discussing the day's students and their progress. Working in the garden with Marcus, planting vegetables that would feed witness families during their stays at the ranch. Reading letters from former students who'd found their own ways to serve justice in their communities. On quiet nights, Rebecca would sometimes walk to the memorial garden they'd created for Morrison's victims. The white stones gleamed in moonlight, each name a reminder of why their work mattered. She'd whisper updates to the dead, new laws passed, corrupt officials arrested, communities freed from fear, maintaining a connection to those whose deaths had given meaning to her survival. The final stone in the garden bore no name, only an Tazinko inscription Rebecca had chosen for those whose stories were never told, whose voices were never heard, whose deaths demanded justice that came too late. May their silence teach us to speak louder for those who still can be saved. Standing before that stone on the 10th anniversary of Morrison's execution, Rebecca reflected on how completely her life had been transformed by that terrible night beneath his gallows. The frightened teacher who'd prayed for meaning in death had become a woman whose life radiated purpose, whose survival had catalyzed changes that protected thousands of others. The work would continue long after she was gone. The academy would train new generations of civic leaders. The federal systems would evolve and improve, and somewhere in communities not yet corrupted, people would remember that ordinary citizens possessed the power to demand justice from those who governed them. Rebecca's prayer beneath Morrison's gallows had been answered not with rescue, but with resurrection, not just of her own life, but of the possibility that frontier communities could choose law over lawlessness, justice over expedience, hope over the cynicism that allowed evil to flourish in darkness. The gallows was gone. The woman had survived, and justice had found its voice in the most unlikely places, proving that even the darkest moments could become the foundation for triumphs that echoed through generations, yet unborn. As Rebecca entered her 40th year, the scope of her influence had expanded beyond anything she could have imagined during those desperate hours beneath Morrison's gallows. The Federal Frontier Justice Commission had grown from a single-person operation into a comprehensive agency with field offices in 12 territories and a staff of over 200 investigators, legal advocates, and administrative personnel. Commission's headquarters occupied an entire building in Denver, its halls lined with photographs of communities that had been liberated from corrupt authority. Each image told a story of transformation towns where children now played safely in streets once patrolled by criminal lawmen, courthouses where honest judges dispensed impartial justice, schools where teachers could educate without fear of retaliation for teaching constitutional principles. But Rebecca's proudest achievement wasn't the institutional success. It was the network of former students and colleagues who'd taken her methods and adapted them to challenges she'd never anticipated. In Oregon Territory, a former Academy graduate named Thomas Chin had exposed a conspiracy to enslave Chinese immigrants. In Dakota Territory, Sarah Wyndham, one of Rebecca's first students, had documented systematic theft of Native American food supplies and brought federal intervention that saved thousands from starvation. The techniques Rebecca had developed through necessity in Millbrook had evolved into a comprehensive methodology for citizen-led anti-corruption efforts. Universities back east now offered courses in Walsh investigative principles, named after the detailed documentation methods she'd used to expose Morrison's crimes. Law enforcement academies taught her witness protection protocols, while journalism schools studied her approach to gathering testimony from traumatized victims. Yet success brought unexpected complications. Rebecca found herself caught between competing visions of American expansion: those who saw the frontier as an opportunity to replicate Eastern legal systems, and those who believed Western communities required different approaches to justice. Her advocacy for Native American land rights and Mexican property protections had made her controversial among politicians who favored rapid assimilation and territorial development. The conflict came to a head During the Wyoming statehood hearings, when territorial representatives accused Rebecca of obstructing progress by insisting on protections for minority populations, Senator Bradford Hayes of Massachusetts led the criticism, arguing that Rebecca's excessive concern for savage and foreign interests was preventing the orderly development of American civilization. Rebecca's response to Hayes became legendary among frontier communities. Standing before the Senate Territorial Committee, she delivered what newspapers called the Gallows speech, a detailed accounting of how Morrison's crimes had begun with the dehumanization of society's most vulnerable members. Senator Hayes speaks of savage interests, Rebecca said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed hearing room. But I have seen true savagery, and it wore a badge and spoke English. Caleb Morrison didn't begin by murdering prominent citizens. He started with people society had taught him to consider expendable. Native families, Mexican settlers, single women, children whose parents had no political connections. She paused, letting the silence underscore her words. Every great crime begins with small cruelties that good people choose to ignore. Every corrupt sheriff starts by victimizing those who have no voice in territorial politics. If we don't protect the most vulnerable among us, we create the conditions that allow evil to flourish until it threatens everyone. The speech was reprinted in newspapers from coast to coast, galvanizing support for Rebecca's inclusive vision of frontier justice. Wyoming achieved statehood with constitutional protections for minority rights that became models for subsequent territorial applications, but the political battles took their toll on Rebecca's health and spirit. Marcus noticed her increasing fatigue, the way she sometimes stared into the distance during conversations, lost in memories of victims whose stories had become part of her daily consciousness. The weight of carrying so many tragedies was slowly crushing even her remarkable resilience. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, the territorial physician who'd become Rebecca's personal doctor and close friend, recommended a sabbatical from federal duties. "You've been fighting other people's battles for 15 years, Dr. Hartwell observed during Rebecca's annual examination. Your body is telling you it's time to rest, to heal, to remember that you're a human being, not just a symbol of justice." The sabbatical began as a simple retreat to the ranch, intended to last a few months while Rebecca recovered her strength. But as weeks turned into seasons, she discovered unexpected peace in returning to the basic work of education and community building. The academy had evolved far beyond her original vision, with specialized programs in constitutional law, territorial governance, and cross-cultural mediation. Ayanna had returned from Harvard Law School as the academy's first Native American instructor, bringing expertise in federal Indian law that complemented Rebecca's experience with territorial corruption. Together, they developed new curricula that prepared students to serve as bridges between traditional tribal governance and American legal systems. "You taught me that justice isn't about revenge," Ayanna said during one of their evening walks through the memorial garden. "It's about preventing future victims by creating systems that protect everyone, especially those who can't protect themselves." Rebecca smiled, recognizing her own evolution reflected in her former student. "You've taught me something too, Ayanna. That survival isn't enough, and neither is justice. We have to build something that outlasts us, something that makes the world better for people we'll never meet." The Academy's 20th anniversary celebration brought together over 300 graduates from across the Western Territories. They came as judges and legislators, teachers and journalists, federal agents and tribal advocates. Each carried the principles Rebecca had distilled from her experience with Morrison, that ordinary citizens possess the power to demand accountability from those in authority, that careful documentation could overcome even the most entrenched corruption, and that individual courage could inspire systemic change. Among the celebration's guests was President McKinley himself, who traveled west specifically to honor Rebecca's contributions to territorial development. In his speech, he credited her work with preventing dozens of potential Millbrooks from developing into centers of criminal authority. Miss Walsh has demonstrated that American democracy depends not on the virtue of our leaders, but on the vigilance of our citizens, the president declared. Her methods have become essential tools for ensuring that expansion of our nation's boundaries includes expansion of our highest principles. But Rebecca's most treasured moment came during a private conversation with Chen Liu, a Chinese immigrant whose family had been saved by one of her investigations. Chen had become a successful merchant in San Francisco and had traveled to the anniversary specifically to thank Rebecca for work she'd almost forgotten. "My grandfather taught me that a life saved becomes responsible for saving others," Chen told her. "You saved my family when I was 12 years old. Since then, I've tried to honor that debt by helping other immigrant families navigate American legal systems. Your example showed me that one person's courage can protect countless others." Stories like Chen's multiplied throughout the celebration. A Methodist minister whose congregation had been freed from a corrupt territorial judge. A Blackfoot woman whose tribal lands had been restored through Rebecca's documentation of illegal seizures. A former slave whose family had escaped kidnapping by human traffickers operating under official protection. Each testimony reminded Rebecca that her survival beneath Morrison's gallows had created ripples that continued spreading across the continent. Her prayer for meaning had been answered in ways that exceeded her desperate hopes, transforming a moment of ultimate powerlessness into a lifetime of empowering others. The celebration's climax came with the dedication of the Rebecca Walsh Center for Frontier Justice, a research institute that would preserve the documentation techniques she'd developed and train future generations of citizen investigators. The center's library contained over 10,000 case files from corruption investigations throughout the territories, creating an unprecedented archive of how ordinary people could challenge corrupt authority. As autumn deepened into winter, at the ranch, Rebecca found herself contemplating retirement from active federal service. At 45, she'd survived assassination attempts, political battles, and the psychological toll of carrying thousands of victims' stories. The center would continue her work, the academy would train new advocates, and the federal systems would evolve under younger leadership. But correspondence from frontier communities continued, arriving daily reports of new corruption schemes, requests for investigation assistance, pleas for help from families facing the same terrors Rebecca had documented in Millbrook. Each letter reminded her that while systems had improved dramatically, individual predators still sought power through badges and official positions. The decision to continue came through an unexpected source. A package arrived from the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, containing artifacts that had been donated to represent frontier justice development. Among them was the noose that had been intended for Rebecca's execution, the very rope Morrison had planned to use for her murder beneath his gallows. Holding that rope 15 years after her near death, Rebecca felt a profound sense of completion. The physical symbol of her intended destruction had become a museum piece, preserved as evidence of how close American frontier communities had come to complete lawlessness. Her survival had transformed an instrument of murder into a historical artifact, proof that evil could be overcome by individual courage and collective action. That evening, she wrote letters to President McKinley and the Federal Frontier Justice Commission, formally requesting extension of her federal appointment for another 5 years. Her explanation was simple: the work continues because the need continues. As long as there are communities where badges serve greed instead of justice, there will be people who need someone to document their stories and demand accountability from those in power. Marcus supported her decision without reservation. "We've built something worth protecting here," he said as they planned for renewed travels and investigations. "But more importantly, we've learned how to replicate it anywhere corruption threatens innocent people. 5 more years should be enough to establish the system so thoroughly that they'll survive without us." The final phase of Rebecca's federal career focused on international expansion of her methods. Reports reached Washington of corruption problems in American territorial possessions acquired from the Spanish-American War, particularly in the Philippines and Puerto Rico, where colonial administrators operated with minimal oversight and maximum opportunity for personal enrichment. Rebecca's appointment as Special Investigator for Colonial Administration marked the first time an American woman had been granted federal authority in overseas territories. Her mission was to establish accountability systems that would prevent colonial officials from replicating the patterns of abuse that had once plagued the American frontier. The work required adapting her documentation techniques to different languages, legal systems, and cultural contexts. But the fundamental principles remained: constant, careful gathering of witness testimony, systematic documentation of official misconduct, and coordination with higher authorities who possessed the power to enforce accountability. In Puerto Rico, she exposed a network of colonial judges who'd been selling legal decisions to plantation owners, systematically dispossessing small farmers of their ancestral lands. The investigation led to the dismissal of 12 officials and the establishment of federal oversight systems that protected property rights for native families. The Philippines presented even greater challenges, with corruption investigations complicated by ongoing insurgency and military occupation. But Rebecca's experience with frontier violence had prepared her for dangerous conditions, and her reputation for fairness had earned trust among Filipino communities who'd suffered under both Spanish colonial rule and American military administration. Her final major investigation uncovered systematic theft of Reconstruction funds intended for Manila's infrastructure development. Colonial administrators had diverted millions of dollars to personal accounts while allowing roads, schools, and hospitals to remain in ruins. The scandal reached Washington and led to comprehensive reforms in colonial administration throughout American overseas territories. As Rebecca prepared to conclude her federal career on her 50th birthday, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun beneath Morrison's gallows. The frightened teacher who'd prayed for her death to have meaning had become a figure whose influence extended from territorial American communities to overseas colonial possessions. The ranch had become a pilgrimage destination for people seeking inspiration for their own fights against corruption and injustice. The Academy's graduates were scattered throughout American territories and possessions, serving as teachers, lawyers, judges, and federal officials who carried forward the principles Rebecca had distilled from her survival experience. But perhaps her greatest achievement was the transformation of how American society understood the relationship between individual courage and systemic change. Rebecca's story had proven that ordinary citizens possessed the power to challenge even the most entrenched corruption, that careful documentation could overcome official denials, and that survival without purpose was merely delayed death. Standing in the memorial garden on a clear winter evening, surrounded by stones bearing the names of Morrison's victims, Rebecca offered a final prayer, not for meaning this time, but in gratitude for meaning discovered and shared. Her survival had honored the dead by preventing countless future victims. Her documentation had created legal protections that would outlast her lifetime, and her example had inspired generations of Americans to demand accountability from those entrusted with power. The gallows rope was safely preserved in Washington's Smithsonian, transformed from an instrument of murder into a symbol of triumphant justice. The woman who'd survived beneath it had lived to see corruption challenged wherever it arose. From frontier mining camps to colonial administrative offices halfway around the world. Her prayer beneath Morrison's gallows had been answered beyond her wildest hopes, proving that even the darkest moments could become foundations for triumphs that echoed through generations, protecting countless lives she would never know, but whose safety would forever validate her choice to survive with purpose rather than perish in despair. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.